Hey folks! This time we're sitting down with one of the most extraordinary women the Tudor age ever produced. And trust me, that is saying something, because that particular era was absolutely packed with extraordinary women who history then promptly forgot about. Margaret Douglas. You might not know her name. You probably don't, honestly, and that's not your fault. She tends to get squeezed out of the story by the bigger, louder figures orbiting around her. But here's the thing. She was imprisoned multiple times for falling in love. She had a law passed essentially because of her. She outlived almost everyone who ever tried to destroy her, and her grandson became King of England. We're going deep into the grit, the mud, and the sheer bloody-minded ambition that define the Tudor fringes. It's a story of bars, bolts, and very poor choices in men. So, yeah, stick around for this one, and if you're enjoying it already, do us a favour and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more than you might think. So, let's get into it. It's October 1515. We're in Northumberland, which, let's be honest, is still dramatic beauty today. But back then, it was the absolute edge of the known universe. There's a castle there called Harbottle. Sounds like a brand of cheap gin, doesn't it? Anyway, Harbottle Castle was a cold, draughty, stone-cold hellscape. And inside, we have Margaret Tudor, who just happens to be the sister of the infamous Henry VIII. She's currently a queen in exile, fleeing the Scottish lords who, to put it mildly, wanted her head on a stick, or at least her power. She's heavily pregnant. I mean, proper about to pop. She's been riding through the mud and the rain, fleeing her own kingdom because she made the rather questionable decision to marry a bloke named Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus. Why did she marry him? Well, because he was good-looking. Honestly, Margaret, you pick the handsome one with the nice hair and the great calf muscles, and before you know it, you're hiding in a damp castle in the middle of a border war. Archibald was part of the Red Douglases, not to be confused with the Black Douglases, who were a completely different flavour of trouble. Mind you, the Scots were always splitting themselves into factions based on hair colour, or who stole whose cow last Tuesday. It was an exhausting way to live. Little Margaret Douglas is born in this miserable pile of rocks. Imagine the scene. No silk sheets, no royal physicians, just the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the masonry, and probably a few nervous soldiers outside wondering if the Scots were about to jump the wall. She was a royal brat, but a brat born in the dirt. Her mother, the Queen Dowager of Scotland, was essentially a refugee. It's a bit of a weird start for someone who would end up being one of the most dangerous women in England. You see, Margaret was born into a bit of a legal black hole. Because she was born on English soil, she was technically English, but her mother was a Scottish queen and her father was a Scottish earl. This made her a pawn from the very second she drew breath. Everyone wanted a piece of her, or, more accurately, everyone wanted to use her to get to her uncle, the big man himself, Henry VIII. Henry was, well, he was a bit of a handful, wasn't he? He was currently busy being a young athletic king who hadn't started chopping off heads quite yet, but the potential was definitely there. Funny thing about Harbottle, it's basically a heap of stones now. If you go there today, you can see the mounds where the walls used to be. It's very peaceful, sheep everywhere. It's hard to imagine the absolute stress of a royal birth happening there while soldiers sharpen their pikes in the courtyard. I suppose the sheep have a better time of it now than Margaret Tudor did in 1515. Anyway, after the birth they didn't hang around. They couldn't. The political situation was about as stable as a three-legged stool in a gale. Margaret Tudor eventually dragged her newborn daughter south towards London. Imagine the journey. Weeks of bumping along in a litter through the English countryside. No motorways, no service stations with overpriced sandwiches. Just mud. Lots and lots of mud. They eventually fetched up at the English court, and this is where little Margaret's life gets truly strange. She was brought up in the household of her uncle, the king. Henry VIII actually liked her. At first, she was the favourite niece. He gave her jewels. He gave her fine clothes. She was raised alongside the future Queen Mary I. They were best friends, which is a bit of a tragic detail when you think about how things turned out. They were just two little girls in the middle of a palace, completely unaware that they were both destined to spend a significant portion of their lives worrying about the executioner's axe. The English court was a shark tank. Even as a child, Margaret would have seen the way people whispered behind tapestries. Sorry, I mean wall hangings. She would have seen the way her mother and father's marriage completely disintegrated. It wasn't just a divorce, it was a spectacle. Her father, Angus, turned out to be a bit of a scoundrel. He took her mother's money, took her lands, and then basically went back to Scotland to play both sides. He was a classic border lord, loyal to whoever was paying him that week. This meant Margaret grew up with a very distorted view of love. To her, marriage wasn't about romance, it was about survival. It was about who had the most soldiers, and who was currently in the king's good books. I believe this is where she learned the silent game. She learned how to be charming while keeping her real thoughts buried 5 miles deep. You had to. If you showed a single crack in your armour at Henry's court, the vultures would descend. And then there was the whole legitimacy issue. Her mother claimed the marriage to Angus was void. Angus claimed it wasn't. This meant that, depending on which day of the week it was, Margaret was either a royal princess or a total nobody. Can you imagine the anxiety? One day you're sitting at the high table and the next people are looking at you like you're the gardener's daughter. It's enough to give anyone a complex. Wait, did I mention the food? They ate at Harbottle, salted beef and ale for breakfast. No wonder everyone was so grumpy all the time. If you had to start your day with a pint of warm beer and a piece of meat that's been sitting in a barrel for 6 months, you'd probably start a rebellion too. As Margaret grew up, she became an incredibly sharp-witted young woman. She had that Tudor red hair, not the bright orange kind, but a deep, burnished copper that probably looked amazing in the candlelight of a palace hall. She was educated, she was refined, but beneath it all, she was a Douglas. And the Douglases were famous for one thing. They never, ever, ever gave up. They were like the Terminators of the 16th century. You could take their land, you could lock them up, but they'd just keep coming back for more. She was about 14 or 15 when she really started to realise her own value. She wasn't just a niece, she was a potential heir to the throne. If Henry didn't have a son, and at this point he was starting to get very, very sweaty about that, Margaret Douglas was right there in the line of succession. This made her the most dangerous girl in England, and she knew it. You can see it in her later portraits. That little smirk, that look in her eyes that says, "I know exactly what you're thinking, and I'm 3 steps ahead of you." I wonder if she ever missed the wildness of the north. Probably not. The court was much warmer, but the court had its own kind of winter, a political winter that could freeze your blood in an instant. She was a survivor, though, a royal brat who had learned to walk the tightrope before she could even run. But as we know, the higher you climb, the further there is to fall, and Margaret was about to start climbing very, very high indeed. She was about to enter the world of adult politics, where the stakes weren't just jewels and dresses, but life and death itself. She was about to fall in love, which, in the Tudor court, was usually the first step toward the graveyard. Or the tower. Usually both, if you were particularly unlucky. So, she's at court, right? And for a bit, it's all sugar and spice and everything nice. She's living at Greenwich Palace or Hampton Court, depending on where the king wants to hunt that week, and she is essentially the it girl of the 1530s. Uncle Henry, we're talking about Henry VIII, of course, is in his absolute prime as a total narcissist. He's not the bloated, leg ulcer-ridden man-mountain we see in the later portraits yet. He's still athletikish, though the waistline is definitely starting to lose the battle against those massive meat pies they served at every banquet. Margaret is being raised as a high-status royal. She's given a seat right next to the king's own daughter, Mary. Now, Mary and Margaret are cousins, and they become as thick as thieves. It's quite sweet, actually. Or maybe it was just survival instinct. They're both in this weird, precarious position where their legitimacy is constantly being debated by men in dusty rooms. Mary is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Margaret is the daughter of the king's sister. They're the spare queens. I bet they spent a lot of time whispering in corners about whose father was being the biggest nightmare that month. The court was a weird place to grow up. It smelled. I mean, really smelled. You've got hundreds of people, dogs, horses, and not a single stick of deodorant in sight. They used to scatter rushes on the floors, basically dried grass, to soak up the, well, everything. Spilled ale, grease, dog business. They just kept layering more on top. Henry was incredibly generous with her at first. He bought her frocks, lots of them. He gave her a personal allowance that would make a modern influencer weep with envy. She was effectively the First Lady of the court for a while because Henry was busy trying to get rid of Catherine of Aragon and hadn't quite managed to make Anne Boleyn official yet. So, Margaret gets the best seats, she gets the best horses, she's the golden child. But Henry's moods were, let's call them, unpredictable. One minute he's patting you on the head and giving you a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg, and the next he's screaming about treason because you looked at him funny while he was trying to eat a capon. Everything started to shift when the great matter really kicked off. That's the posh way of saying Henry wanted a divorce so badly he was willing to break the world to get it. When Anne Boleyn finally arrived on the scene as the new queen, Margaret had to navigate a very narrow path. Anne wasn't exactly a fan of the old guard, and since Margaret was best mates with Mary, who Anne absolutely detested, it was all getting a bit spicy. I suppose Margaret learned to be a bit of a chameleon. She had to. One day she's attending Anne's coronation, looking all loyal and happy, and the next she's sneaking letters to Mary, trying to keep her cousin's spirits up. It was a dangerous game. If Anne had found out, Margaret would have been in the soup, deep in it. There was this one time, around 1533, when the court went on a massive progress through the countryside. Imagine the logistics. It's like a rock star touring, but with more beards and fewer electric guitars. Margaret would have been right there in the thick of it, riding her horse through the muddy lanes of southern England, pretending she wasn't terrified that her uncle might suddenly decide she was a threat to his new marriage. Because Henry didn't have a son yet, Margaret was very close to the throne. This made her a person of interest for every ambitious bloke in the country. She was a prize, a walking, talking land grant with a royal pedigree, and Henry was starting to realise that his favourite niece was also a potential rival. If he died without a boy, the crown could go to her, or to Mary. It was a mess, a complete and utter shambles. Did she actually like the jewellery? Or did it just feel like a very expensive leash? She had these necklaces made of massive pearls, the kind that looked like they'd give you a permanent neckache. The atmosphere at court became increasingly paranoid as the 1530s rolled on. People were being arrested left, right, and centre. You'd go to sleep wondering if your neighbour would still have a head by breakfast. Margaret stayed quiet. She played the part of the dutiful niece. She danced at the masques. She played the lute. She probably sat through some incredibly boring sermons about how the king was the head of the church now and everyone else should just shut up and deal with it. Mind you, she wasn't just a passive observer. She was soaking it all up. She was watching how Anne Boleyn handled power and how she eventually lost it. She was watching how the Howard family, Anne's relatives, were manoeuvring themselves into every crack and crevice of the government. They were like ivy, weren't they? Growing over everything, looking pretty but slowly strangling the life out of whatever they touched. Margaret Douglas was not a Howard by blood, at least not on her mother's side, but she was inextricably linked to them. She became closely associated with the family after entering into a secret engagement with Lord Thomas Howard, Anne Boleyn's uncle, in 1535. That connection was about to become the greatest mistake of her life. Young, lonely and isolated, she was surrounded by ambitious men who knew exactly how to manipulate a girl who felt neglected by her terrifying uncle. I bet the wine helped. Tudor wine was apparently quite sweet and often mixed with spices to hide the fact that it was basically turning into vinegar. They called it hippocras. Sounds like something you'd give a sick horse, doesn't it? But they drank it by the gallon. Maybe that's how they all coped with the constant threat of execution. Just stay slightly tipsy and hope for the best. Anyway, Margaret is there, at the heart of the most powerful court in Europe, watching the masks slip. She sees her cousin Mary stripped of her title. She sees her uncle's face turn that particular shade of purple that meant someone was going to the Tower. And she realises, perhaps for the first time, that being a favourite doesn't mean you're safe. It just means you're the last one to be eaten. She needed an ally, someone of her own, someone who wasn't her terrifying uncle or her miserable cousin. And that's when she laid eyes on Lord Thomas Howard. He was the younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk. He was dashing. He was charming. He was also, quite frankly, a bit of a disaster waiting to happen. But when you're 19 and your life is a series of controlled performances, a bit of disaster can look an awful lot like freedom. It started with looks. then notes, then secret meetings in the gardens where the scent of damp earth and roses probably made everything feel a lot more romantic than it actually was. They were flirting with fire. No, they were flirting with a bloody volcano, and the first sparks were just about to fly. So, Thomas Howard. Let's talk about Thomas. He wasn't the big cheese, the Duke of Norfolk. That was his brother. But he was very much part of that Howard machine that seemed to produce slightly arrogant men like a factory line. He was a younger son, the sort of bloke who has a bit too much time on his hands, a very sharp set of clothes, and an eye for an opportunity. And there was Margaret Douglas. She was 20, vibrant, and quite frankly, probably a bit bored of watching her Uncle Henry change wives like most people change their socks. It started quietly, a few glances across the Great Hall at Whitehall, maybe a lingering hand touch during a dance. Dancing back then wasn't exactly a private affair. You had about 50 people watching your every move to see if your knees buckled, but somehow they managed to find these little pockets of silence. They began swapping poems. Now, Tudor poetry is a bit of a mixed bag. Everyone was trying to be Thomas Wyatt, but most of them ended up sounding like a greeting card written by someone with a heavy fever. But Margaret, she was hooked. She and Thomas started meeting in the palace gardens. They had these middlemen, servants who were essentially professional secret keepers, who would carry notes back and forth. It was a thrill. For the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't just a piece of political furniture. She was a woman with a secret. Mind you, the Howard family was basically the Tudor version of a crime syndicate. They were everywhere. They had their fingers in every pie, and usually those pies were filled with treason and ambition. Thomas knew exactly who Margaret was. He knew she was the king's niece. He knew she was a potential heir. While there was definitely some genuine spark there, Thomas also had his eyes on the prize. If he married Margaret, he was one heartbeat away from the throne. That's a very intoxicating thought for a younger brother, with nothing but a fancy name and a few drafty manners to his own. They decided to go all in. They didn't just have a fling, they entered into a pre-contract. Now, this is the bit where it gets really muddy. In the 16th century, if you stood in a room with someone and said, "I take you as my wife," and they said, "I take you as my husband," you were legally married in the eyes of the church. You didn't need a priest. You didn't need a cake. You didn't even need a witness, although it helped if you wanted to prove it later. It was called per verba de presenti. It was a legal nightmare waiting to happen. They did it, probably in some candlelit corner of the palace while the guards were busy elsewhere. They exchanged gifts. She gave him a ring, I think. He probably gave her something equally expensive that he'd bought on credit. They were officially, secretly, and very illegally committed to each other. The candles. Did you know they used to make them out of animal fat? Tallow candles. They smelled like a frying pan that hadn't been washed since the Middle Ages. Imagine trying to have a romantic secret wedding while the lights are literally screaming melted cow at you. Anyway, they thought they were being clever. They thought they could wait for the right moment to tell the king. But the right moment with Henry VIII was like trying to find a dry patch of ground in a swamp. While they were busy whispering sweet nothings, the world around them was exploding. Anne Boleyn was currently in the process of losing her head. The Howards were suddenly radioactive. They were being scrubbed from the court like a bad stain. And then someone talked. Someone always talks. In a palace with 1,000 ears, a secret has the shelf life of a ripe prawn in the sun. Rumours started to swirl. People noticed that Margaret and Thomas were spending an awful lot of time together. They noticed the looks. They noticed the missing ring. And eventually the whispers reached the big man himself. Henry was livid. It wasn't just that his niece had a boyfriend. It was that she had married into the Howard family without his permission. This was a direct challenge to his authority. He had just passed a law, the Act of Succession, that made it high treason for anyone of royal blood to marry without the king's say-so. He'd literally just written the rulebook, and Margaret had used it as kindling for her romance. Henry felt a bit betrayed. He'd been nice to her. He'd bought her the pearls. He'd given her a place at his table, and here she was, plotting with a Howard behind his back. It was the ultimate insult to a man who demanded total, unblinking loyalty. Thomas Howard must have been absolutely terrified when the guards showed up. One minute you're the secret husband of a royal princess, and the next you're being marched towards the Tower of London. Margaret was arrested too. They didn't care that she was a woman. They didn't care that she was family. In Henry's eyes, she was a traitor. She was stripped of her finery. No more silk, no more pearls, just the cold reality of a stone cell. They were hauled before the council. The questions were relentless. Did you promise yourself to him? When? Where? Who saw you? Margaret, to her credit, didn't fold immediately. She was a Douglas after all. She had that stubbornness in her bones. She tried to play it off as a youthful indiscretion, but the evidence was stacked against her like a wall of bricks. The court was in an uproar. Here was the king's niece, the girl who had been raised in the very heart of the royal family, caught in a forbidden love with the uncle of a disgraced and executed queen. It makes you wonder about the psychology of it all. Why did they do it? Were they just two kids in over their heads? Or was it a calculated power move that went horribly wrong? You don't take vows like that in a Tudor palace unless you're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, or maybe just very, very lonely. The atmosphere in London changed overnight. The golden girl was gone. In her place was a prisoner. The king was busy preparing for his next marriage, to Jane Seymour this time, and he wanted this Howard mess cleaned up as quickly and as brutally as possible. He wanted to make an example of them. He wanted everyone to know that no one, not even his favourite niece, was above his law. I believe she probably sat in her room before the guards came, looking at the ring Thomas had given her, wondering how it had all gone so spectacularly wrong. One day you're the star of the show, and the next you're just another name on a list of people the king wants to disappear. The silence of the palace must have felt heavier than the stones themselves. The romance was over. The nightmare was just beginning. One minute you're the brightest star in the firmament, the girl everyone wants to be seen with at the banquet, and the next you're being rowed down the Thames under a bridge that's probably dripping with the unspeakable runoff of a city that didn't believe in sewers. It's a long way down. The transition from the velvet-lined rooms of Greenwich to the grey, unforgiving limestone of the Tower must have felt like a physical blow, a heavy, echoing thud that probably vibrated right through the soles of her silk slippers and up into her teeth, which were likely chattering by now from the sudden damp chill of the river air. Henry VIII was beyond furious. He wasn't just annoyed, he was the kind of angry that makes people's hair fall out. He felt that Margaret had fundamentally undermined his act of succession, which he'd basically just finished writing. It's like when you spend all day building a massive Lego set and someone walks by and kicks it, just to see what happens. Except, in this case, the Lego set is the entire legal framework of the British throne, and the someone is your favourite niece who's decided to marry a bloke you've just decided you hate. Fact is, Margaret was arguably the first person to be hit by this brand new law. Henry rushed a Bill of Attainder through Parliament. This is basically a guilty because the king says so document. No trial, no jury. Just a quick vote by a bunch of terrified men in robes and bam, you're a traitor. It's a bit efficient, I suppose, if you're a tyrant, but it's a bit of a nightmare if you're the one in the cell. She wasn't thrown into a literal hole in the ground. She was a royal, after all. She was likely kept in the lieutenant's lodgings, or perhaps the bell tower. It's still the tower, though. It's still a place where the walls feel like they're leaning in on you, whispering about all the people who walked through those doors and never walked out again. She was sick. Truly. I suspect the stress of the arrest, combined with the sudden change in diet and the dampness, just broke her down. She developed some kind of fever or perhaps a lung infection. She was bedridden for a long time. It's quite pathetic, really, when you think about it. This vibrant, tall, copper-haired woman reduced to a pale shadow, shivering under wool blankets while guards paced outside her door. I believe Henry actually felt a tiny, microscopic twinge of something resembling guilt. Or maybe he just didn't want the paperwork of his niece dying on his watch. He sent his own physicians to see her. Now, 16th century doctors, they're a worry, aren't they? Their primary solution to everything was either bleed them or give them something made of crushed beetles, while my grandmother used to swear by a spoonful of honey and lemon, which seems infinitely more sensible than whatever those blokes were brewing in their brass pots. Margaret was languishing in her room. Thomas Howard was in a much worse state. He was in a different part of the fortress. They weren't allowed to see each other. Not even a note. Imagine the agony of that. You've risked your life for this person. You've basically blown up your entire future for a few secret kisses, and now you're both rotting in the same building, separated by 10 feet of solid English oak and stone, and you have no idea if the other person is even still breathing. Henry's lawyers were busy trying to find a way to make it look like they'd committed a crime before the law was even passed. Retroactive justice. It's a classic move. They wanted to prove that Margaret and Thomas had been plotting to take the throne. The truth? They were probably just two people who got swept up in the drama of it all. Mind you, the Howard family were busy distancing themselves from Thomas as fast as humanly possible. His brother, the Duke of Norfolk, was basically the world champion of, "I don't know that guy." He wrote letters to the king saying Thomas was a fool and a disgrace. With family like that, who needs executioners? It's a bit cold, isn't it? Just tossing your own brother to the wolves to save your own skin. I suppose when the wolves have crowns on their heads, you don't take many chances. Margaret's mother, Margaret Tudor, was back in Scotland, and she was apoplectic. She started firing off letters to Henry, begging him to be merciful. She was using every motherly card in the deck. She's just a child. She was led astray. She's your own blood. Henry, being Henry, probably just used the letters to wipe food remnants from his mouth. He was done with the Douglases for a while. There's this bit of uncertainty about her daily life there. Did she have books? Did she have her loot? I like to think she spent a lot of time staring out the window at the patch of sky she could see through the bars. Maybe watching the ravens. You know the legend about the ravens, don't you? If they leave the tower, the kingdom falls. After all, the months dragged on. From the heat of July into the grey, drizzling misery of a London winter. Margaret stayed in her room. Thomas stayed in his. The romance that had seemed so bright and revolutionary in the gardens of the palace was now just a heavy weight around their necks. She must started to regret it. Just a little bit. When the fever was high and the room was dark and the only sound was the wind off the Thames, she must have wondered if Thomas Howard's smile was really worth the loss of her freedom. The Tudor blood in her was strong, though. She didn't break. She didn't confess to some grand conspiracy. She just waited and waited. The political wind was shifting again, as it always did with Henry. He'd married Jane Seymour, and she was actually quite kind. She was the peacemaker queen. She started whispering in Henry's ear that maybe, just maybe, he'd been a bit too harsh on his niece. Jane was the only one who could really handle Henry when he was in one of his I am the law moods. But for Thomas, there was no Queen Jane to save him. He was becoming more and more ill. The tower was doing its work. It was a slow, grinding process of decay. He was losing his mind, losing his strength, and losing the will to keep fighting the charges. Margaret, meanwhile, was moved. Not out of the tower, but to a different location, Syon Abbey. It was a bit of a promotion. Less prisoner, more lady in forced retirement. She was under the watchful eye of the abbess. It was quieter, cleaner. But it was still a cage. She was still a traitor in the eyes of the man who held her life in his hands. She probably sat in the gardens there, looking at the plants and thinking about the life she'd lost. The court was moving on without her. There were new scandals, new favourites, new faces. She was yesterday's news, a footnote in a very long, very bloody book. And then the news came from the tower. Thomas was dead. So, Thomas Howard is dead. Just like that. October 1537 arrives with a cold, biting wind that probably made the stones of the Tower of London feel like blocks of ice. And Thomas, poor, ambitious, rather foolish Thomas, simply gives up the ghost. It wasn't the axe that got him in the end. No, it was the ague, which is basically a fancy Tudor way of saying he caught a nasty fever. And his body, weakened by months of damp walls and probably some very questionable prison stew, just couldn't take it anymore. There's something particularly grim about dying in a cell for a love that the king has already declared illegal and void. It's like being deleted from history before you've even finished your final sentence. Margaret is still at Sion Abbey when the news reaches her. Imagine the scene. A messenger arrives, mud-spattered and smelling of wet horse, and she's told that the man she risked everything for, her status, her freedom, her very head, is now just a body being prepped for a quiet, rather shameful burial at Thetford Priory. Did she cry? Maybe. I believe she must have felt a crushing sense of waste. But here's the thing about Margaret Douglas. She was a survivor first and a romantic second. You don't last 5 minutes in the Tudor court if you spend all your time weeping over spilt milk, or in this case, a dead Howard. The timing of his death was, in a morbidly convenient way, exactly what she needed. With Thomas gone, the threat he posed to the succession through her was effectively neutralised. Henry VIII didn't have to worry about a Howard Douglas power couple anymore, and Henry himself was going through a bit of a rough patch. His true wife, Jane Seymour, had just died after giving birth to the future Edward VI. The king was in a state of absolute wall-thumping grief. He was shut up in his rooms, eating his feelings, and probably making everyone's life a total misery. Henry was a man of extremes. When he was happy, everyone got gold. When he was sad, everyone stayed in the dark. Anyway, Margaret sees a gap. She starts writing letters. Not the "I'm so sorry I married a traitor" kind of letters, but more the "I am your humble, obedient niece who has learned her lesson and really wants to come home." Variety. She was crawling. She had to. If she stayed at Sion, she was a non-entity. If she got back to court, she was back in the game. It's a narrow escape, really. She could have been left to rot in that abbey for decades. I suspect she used her relationship with her cousin Mary to help smooth things over. Mary was back in Henry's good books, mostly because she'd finally agreed to say her own mother's marriage was incestuous and illegal, which is a hell of a price to pay for a bedroom at court. Mary and Margaret were two peas in a very dented, very scarred pod. They both knew that to survive Henry, you had to be willing to swallow your pride until you choked on it. Eventually the king relents. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he just wanted someone around who reminded him of the good old days before he started executing his wives. Margaret is allowed back, but it's not the same. She's not the golden girl anymore. She's the niece who messed up. She's under a cloud. She's basically on permanent probation. Every time she walks into a room, she can probably feel the eyes of the courtiers on her, wondering if she's going to trip up again. The court she returns to is a different beast entirely. It's quieter, more sombre. The ghost of Jane Seymour is everywhere. Margaret has to be careful, super careful. No more secret notes, no more flirting in the gardens. She has to be the perfect, dutiful royal lady. I bet it was exhausting, like trying to walk on eggshells while wearing heavy boots. There's this one detail that always sticks with me. She had to give up the jewels, the ones Henry had given her before the scandal. She was effectively stripped of her personal wealth and made a dependent of the crown again. Imagine having to ask your terrifying uncle for money every time you need a new pair of gloves or some thread for your embroidery. She knows she's still a Douglas. She knows her mother is still the Queen Dowager of Scotland, even if her mother is currently busy trying to divorce Archibald Douglas, which was a whole other mess. Margaret is basically a woman without a country. Too English for the Scots, too Scottish for the English. She's a political orphan. But she's a smart political orphan. She starts building bridges. She makes herself useful to Mary. She stays out of the way of the new factions that are starting to form around the young Prince Edward. She becomes a fixture of the royal household, a permanent +1 who knows where all the bodies are buried, but has the sense to keep her mouth shut. She probably felt a secret bit of relief when Thomas died, not because she didn't love him, but because his death meant the case against her was closed. You can't be punished for a forbidden marriage if one half of the marriage is in the ground, can you? It's a brutal way to look at it, but Tudor life was brutal. It was all about the next move. She was living in a sort of golden cage again. Better than the Tower, obviously, but still a cage. She was waiting for the next change in the weather. And with Henry VIII, the weather changed every 5 minutes. New wives were on the horizon. New religious laws were being hammered out. The whole country was in a state of flux. She wasn't just sitting around, she was watching, learning. She'd seen how the Howards had fallen. She'd seen how the Seymours had risen. She was absorbing the mechanics of power. She was becoming the woman who would one day try to put her own family on the throne of 2 different countries. But, For now. For now, she was just Margaret Douglas, the girl who had survived a brush with the axe and was determined never to get that close to the sharp edge ever again. There is a story, might be rubbish, that she kept a lock of Thomas's hair in a locket. If she did, she would have had to hide it. If Henry had seen it, he'd probably have lost his rag all over again. It's a nice thought, though. A tiny bit of rebellion kept close to her heart, while she bowed and scraped before the king. She's 22. She's seen more drama than most people see in 3 lifetimes. And she's just getting started. The narrow escape wasn't the end of her story. It was just the end of the first act. The next bit? Well, the next bit involves a lot of weddings. And unfortunately for Margaret, she's usually the one holding the flowers while someone else gets the crown. She spent a lot of time in the apartments of Princess Mary during this period. They were a bit of a gloomy pair, I reckon. Mary, mourning her mother and her status. Margaret, mourning her lover and her reputation. They probably drank a lot of that spiced wine and complained about the king's new advisors. And then, Henry decides it's time to find a new queen. And Margaret, as the king's niece, has to be right there in the front row, smiling like nothing ever happened. It's the ultimate test of her acting skills. So, there she is, back in the thick of it, acting as the ultimate royal accessory, while her Uncle Henry embarks on what can only be described as the world's most dangerous and expensive dating spree. Margaret Douglas has gone from being a prisoner to being a professional bridesmaid. It's a weird gig, isn't it? One day, you're in a cell wondering if you'll ever see the sun again, and the next, you're standing in a drafty chapel holding the train of a woman who's about to become the 4th, or 5th, or 6th Queen of England. She must have had a permanent customer service smile plastered onto her face, the kind you wear when you're at a wedding you don't want to be at, but you know the bar is free and your terrifying boss is watching your every move. First up on the matrimonial conveyor belt was Anne of Cleves. Now, this was a disaster from the word go. Henry had seen a portrait of her, painted by Hans Holbein, who was basically the 16th century version of a high-end Photoshop artist, and decided she was his dream girl. Mind you, when she actually turned up in person, Henry was, well, he was disappointed. He famously called her a Flanders mare, which is a bit rich coming from a man who was rapidly turning into a human-sized Christmas ham himself. Margaret had to be there to welcome her. She was one of the top-tier ladies sent to meet Anne at the coast. Imagine the awkwardness. You're standing there in the cold wind, greeting this poor German woman who doesn't speak a word of English. Margaret had to navigate the fallout of that non-marriage while keeping her own head down. She was basically Anne's lady-in-waiting, which meant she had to sit through all those excruciatingly quiet dinners where Henry wouldn't even look at his new wife. I suppose the sheer weight of the dresses didn't help the mood. Have you ever actually looked at what they wore? Layers and layers of velvet, silk, buckram and whalebone. And the pins. They didn't have zips, you see. Everything was pinned together. One wrong move, and you've got a 2-inch brass needle in your ribs. It's a wonder they could dance at all without bleeding out. After the Anne of Cleves fiasco was sorted, which basically involved Henry giving her a bunch of houses to just go away and be his sister, we move straight into the Catherine Howard era. Now, this must have been absolutely terrifying for Margaret. Why? Because Catherine Howard was another Howard. She was the cousin of the man Margaret had illegally married and who had died in the Tower. She was also Margaret's own cousin. Suddenly the Howards were back in favour, and Margaret was right in the middle of it again. She was Catherine's chief lady-in-waiting. She was the one who had to help the teenage queen get dressed, manage her jewels, and, crucially, keep an eye on who was coming and going. Catherine Howard was, well, she was young, and a bit silly, and she liked handsome men. Sound familiar? It's almost like Margaret was watching a slow-motion car crash of her own past. Margaret whispered a few warnings into Catherine's ear, probably saying, "Don't do it, babes. The king has a very short fuse and a very big axe." But Catherine didn't listen. She was busy having secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, which is basically the Tudor equivalent of texting your ex while your husband is asleep in the next room. The smell in the palace during this time must have been something else. Henry's leg ulcer was at its absolute worst. It was this weeping, stinking wound that wouldn't heal. They say you could smell the king coming from 3 rooms away. Imagine trying to be a glamorous lady-in-waiting when the air is thick with the scent of rotting meat and expensive perfume. It's enough to make you want to join a nunnery, isn't it? I can't even deal with a bin that hasn't been emptied for 2 days, let alone a royal gangrene situation. When Catherine Howard's extracurricular activities were finally discovered, the whole court went into meltdown. The Howards were arrested left, right and centre. Margaret must have been shaking in her boots. She'd already been to the Tower once for a Howard-related romance. She wasn't exactly keen for a return visit. She had to distance herself fast. She played the part of the shocked, innocent bystander. Who? Me? I had no idea the Queen was meeting blokes in the back garden. I was too busy with my embroidery. It worked somehow. Henry didn't lock her up this time. I suspect he was starting to realise that his niece was actually quite a useful constant in his life. She was the one who survived all the wives. She was the one who knew the protocol. She was the one who could talk to his daughter Mary when she was being particularly stubborn. Margaret was becoming a fixture of the institution, a survivor who had learned that the best way to stay alive was to be indispensable but invisible. And then came Catherine Parr, the survivor, the one who actually managed to outlive the old man. Margaret was at their wedding too, July of 1543. It was a much quieter affair. No massive tournaments, no frantic welcoming parties at the coast. Just a small ceremony at Hampton Court. Margaret was there, standing behind the bride, probably thinking, "Right, here we go again. How long is this one going to last?" Margaret actually liked Catherine Parr. They were both intellectual women. They both liked the new learning, though Margaret remained a staunch Catholic at heart, while Catherine was leaning towards the messy, new Protestant ideas. They probably spent a lot of time talking about books and theology while Henry was dozing off in his chair, dreaming of the wives he'd already got rid of. Wait, did I tell you about the Tudor obsession with sugar? They put it on everything. Meat, vegetables, wine. Their teeth were basically black stumps. It's a miracle they could eat anything tougher than a boiled turnip. Margaret, being a royal, would have had access to the best sugar, which probably meant her smile was a bit of a horror show if you got too close. Anyway, through all these weddings, Margaret was watching. She was learning how to manage a king. She was learning that power is a fluid thing, and that today's favourite is tomorrow's traitor. She was biding her time. She was nearly 30 now, which was practically middle-aged for a Tudor woman who hadn't managed to get married and have kids yet. She was a bit of an anomaly, a royal princess, still single, still living off her uncle's generosity, and still carry the weight of her past mistakes. But Henry was getting old, he was getting tired, and he was starting to think about what would happen to his niece when he was gone. He needed to settle her. He needed to use her one last time to secure his borders. He wasn't going to let her pick her own husband this time. Oh no. He had a very specific plan. A plan that involved a man who was just as ambitious, just as desperate, and just as dangerous as Margaret herself. She stood in the great hall, watching the sunlight catch the dust motes in the air, waiting for the king's summons. She probably adjusted her French hood, the one that always made her ears itch, and took a deep breath of that cloying, perfumed, rotting air. The next wedding she attended wouldn't be as a bridesmaid. You know, there's a specific kind of stubbornness that only seems to exist in the DNA of the truly highborn, the sort of I know better than the executioner attitude that Margaret Douglas had in spades. I mean, honestly, you've been to the Tower once. Your fiancé died there. You nearly died of a fever while staring at a damp wall. Most people would take that as a fairly loud hint from the universe to maybe, just maybe, take up a quiet hobby like lace making, or perhaps just staring blankly at a hedge for the rest of their lives. But not Margaret. Oh no. She decided to double down. The court of Catherine Howard was essentially a giant, velvet-lined petri dish for bad decisions. It was 1541, and Catherine, the new teenage queen, was basically a child playing at being a grown-up, surrounding herself with people who were just as young, just as reckless, and just as fond of whispering in dark corners as she was. Margaret was her lady-in-waiting. She was supposed to be the sensible one, the older cousin, the one who had already been through the fire. Instead, she fell for Charles Howard. Who was Charles? Well, he was the Queen's brother, and he was a Howard, obviously. Because Margaret apparently had a type, and that type was men who will inevitably get me arrested by my terrifying uncle. Margaret just couldn't resist a Howard. Charles was handsome, probably a bit of a lad, and he was right there, every day, in the Queen's private chambers. They started with the usual Tudor flirtation, the courtly love nonsense that involved a lot of sighing and meaningful glances over the top of a lute. They were exchanging tokens again, bits of ribbon, small rings, the kind of stuff that leaves a paper trail a mile wide if you're not careful. And Margaret? She wasn't being careful, not even a little bit. I have this theory that some people are just addicted to the adrenaline of a secret. It's not even about the person, half the time. It's about the fact that if the door opens right now, you're both dead. The palace was crawling with spies. Thomas Cranmer's men were everywhere. The reformers were looking for any excuse to take down the Howard faction. They were watching the Queen like hawks, and because Margaret was so close to her, they were watching Margaret too. Did she think she was invisible? Maybe. Or maybe she thought her uncle's affection was a permanent shield. It's possible they thought that because Catherine was Queen, the rules had changed. He can't lock up the Queen's brother and his own niece at the same time, surely. He absolutely could. Henry VIII was the king of multitasking when it came to throwing people in the clink. They were meeting in the gallery at Hampton Court. It's a long, echoing space, not exactly the best place for a secret tryst. You can hear a boot click from a mile away. But they didn't care. They were in that bubble of we're special and nothing bad can happen to us. The rumours started to percolate. They always do. A lady's maid notices a missing brooch. A guard sees a shadow where there shouldn't be one. The Howard girl was at it again. That's what they called her. They didn't see her as a victim of love, they saw her as a serial offender. A woman who simply wouldn't learn. The Duke of Norfolk was absolutely foaming at the mouth when he found out. His niece was already the Queen and he was trying to keep her on the straight and narrow, which was like trying to keep a kitten in a basket of wool. And now his brother Charles was off snogging the King's niece. It was a diplomatic nightmare. It was a family disaster. Why do we do it? Why do we go back to the things that hurt us? I believe Margaret saw the Howards as her people, more than the Tudors, more than the Douglases. She felt at home in their ambition. She liked the way they moved through the world like they owned it, even if they were currently moving towards a very sharp piece of steel. The flirtation went on for months. It wasn't just a quick fumble behind a tapestry. It was a sustained, documented romance. They were talking about marriage. Again, without permission. Again. It's the sheer audacity of it that gets me. She'd literally just got her freedom back. It's like getting out of prison for bank robbery and immediately walking into the branch across the street with a balaclava in your pocket. I wonder if she ever talked to Catherine Howard about it. Did the teenage queen giggle and encourage her? Probably. Catherine was basically a child in a crown, and she loved a good romance. They probably sat in the Queen's solar, looking at fabrics and talking about how handsome the Howard men were. Henry was starting to get suspicious of his wife's behaviour too. He was becoming grumpy. His leg was hurting. He was looking for someone to blame for his general sense of unease. And then the letters were found. Not Catherine's letters, not yet, but the ones between Margaret and Charles. Imagine the king sitting at his desk, staring at a piece of parchment that proves his niece is once again flouting his laws. The betrayal, the rage. I bet he didn't even yell at first. He probably just went very, very quiet. That's the scary kind of Henry. The quiet Henry who just starts signing warrants without looking up. Charles Howard was hauled off first. He was questioned. He wasn't quite as stalwart as Thomas had been. Or maybe he just saw the writing on the wall. The Howard charm doesn't work so well when you're being threatened with a rack. Margaret must have heard the news and felt that familiar icy pit in her stomach. The guards were coming. Again. The same boots on the same stairs, the same cold realization that she had blown it. All for a Howard. It's almost impressive in a way. The dedication to a bad idea. She didn't run. Where would she go? Scotland was a mess, the north was too far. She just waited in her rooms, probably wearing one of those scratchy wool dresses she'd grown to hate, listening for the sound of the yeomen. The most tragic thing is that she probably thought it was worth it. For a few months she wasn't just a political pawn. She was a woman in love. even if that love was a ticking time bomb. The tragedy of Margaret Douglas isn't just that she was imprisoned, it's that she kept handing the king the keys to her cell. She was her own worst enemy, wrapped in silk and Tudor pride. And then the door opened. So the guards arrived, and let me tell you, it wasn't a polite knock on the door and a cup of tea kind of visit, but rather a clanking, armour-heavy intrusion that meant the game was finally up, and Margaret was once again headed for a very uncomfortable conversation with Uncle Henry. He was livid, properly fuming. It's a wonder he had any blood pressure left to spare given how much he was currently dealing with, his wife's infidelity, his own failing health, and the general feeling that the entire world was conspiring to make his afternoon naps impossible. He sent her to Scion Abbey. Again. It's like her personal time-out corner. I suppose he just didn't know what else to do with a niece who seemed determined to collect Howards like they were shiny trading cards. Busted. Mind you, the whole Catherine Howard business was unfolding at the same time, and it was a total bloodbath, literally, with heads rolling, and everyone in the Howard family tree trying to pretend they'd never even heard the name Catherine before. Margaret was in a weird spot. She was Catherine's lady-in-waiting, which usually means you're complicit in the eyes of the law, but somehow she managed to skate by with just a firm reprimand and another stint in royal daycare at the Abbey. Maybe Henry just couldn't be bothered to execute his own sister's kid. She was family, and being the king's blood was the only thing standing between you and a very sharp axe. Eventually, Henry decided she needed a husband he could actually trust, or at least one he could use as a political weapon against the Scots, who were being their usual difficult selves up north. Enter Matthew Stewart. He was the 4th Earl of Lennox. He was Scottish, and he was willing to sell out his own country for a chance at the English inner circle. Margaret was almost 30 by now, a bit long in the tooth for a first marriage in those days. She didn't really have a choice. It was either marry this bloke or spend the rest of her life staring at the walls of a convent or waiting for Henry to have another bad day. They got married at St. James's Palace in 1544. It might have been a decent match, strangely enough. Matthew was just as ambitious as she was. They were like a 16th century power couple, plotting over their breakfast ale about how to get their hands on the Scottish throne. They had kids too. Most of them didn't make it, which was just the reality of the time. No antibiotics, no hygiene, just a lot of prayers and hope. But one of them survived. Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley. Keep that name in the back of your head. He was a piece of work. Margaret spent the next few decades pouring all her hopes, dreams, and terrifying ambition into that boy. She was determined he'd be a king, even if she had to walk over a few bodies to make it happen. The political landscape was shifting under her feet like wet sand. Henry VIII finally kicked the bucket in 1547, and suddenly Margaret's position changed again. Her young cousin Edward was king, but the real power was with the Protestant advisors, who didn't exactly trust a woman with Margaret's complicated past and Catholic leanings. She and Matthew retreated to Yorkshire. Temple Newsome. It's a massive house, and it became the base of operations for her stately home of treason. She wasn't just hosting dinner parties, she was building a network. Maybe she missed the buzz of London, but there's something to be said for being the big fish in a northern pond. She spent years writing letters, smoothing over old grudges and waiting for the right moment to pounce. She was like a spider in the middle of a very large, very sticky web. The embroidery, she was famous for it. She used to stitch little messages and symbols into her work. It's a bit like secret code, but with silk thread. She was creating these massive, complicated tapestries that were basically political manifestos hidden in floral patterns. When Edward VI finally kicked the bucket, and Mary, good old, Catholic, slightly terrifying but loyal Mary, took the throne, Margaret was basically doing backflips in the corridors because her best mate was finally the boss. It was like your friend winning the lottery and suddenly you're both riding in the back of a gold-plated carriage through the streets of London, while everyone who ever doubted you is forced to cheer from the mud. Mind you, Mary's reign wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. She had that whole Bloody Mary reputation for a reason. Mary was just incredibly lonely and perhaps a bit traumatized by her dad. And honestly, who wouldn't be? If your father had been Henry VIII, you'd probably be a bit touchy too. Margaret was the chief mourner at Mary's funeral later on, which tells you everything about their bond. She was the top lady at court, properly back in the sun. Then came Elizabeth. Total disaster for Margaret. Elizabeth I didn't trust Margaret as far as she could throw a grand piano. Mostly because Margaret was a Catholic and had a really strong legitimate claim to the throne that made Elizabeth feel very twitchy. Elizabeth's hair was famously thinning later on and she wore those massive red wigs, whereas Margaret still had that thick Tudor Douglas mane. Small wins. Margaret started plotting almost immediately from her house in Yorkshire. She wanted her son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, to marry Mary, Queen of Scots. This was the ultimate F-you to Elizabeth. It would unite the two strongest claims to the English throne in one tall, incredibly arrogant teenager. A masterstroke. Possibly a suicide mission. She spent months sending secret messengers across the border. It was all very cloak and dagger. Elizabeth found out, of course. Into the Tower. She goes. Again. Third time's a charm. Not really. Most people have a loyalty card for a coffee shop. But Margaret had one for the Lieutenant of the Tower. She was locked up while her son was up in Scotland, behaving like an absolute prat and making Mary, Queen of Scots' life a misery. Darnley was apparently a tall drink of water that had the personality of a wet paper bag. Worse. He was a drunk. Margaret knew her son was a bit of a disappointment, but she was too far gone in her ambition to stop. She was sitting in her cell, probably stitching more of those coded tapestries, while the news from Scotland got worse and worse. First, Mary and Darnley get married. Success. Then Darnley helps murder Mary's secretary, Rizzio, right in front of her. Not so great. Then suddenly the house Darnley is staying in, Kirkhoe Field, explodes. Boom. Just like that. They found Darnley's body in the garden. He hadn't been killed by the blast, he'd been strangled. Margaret was still in the Tower when she heard her favourite son, her golden boy, had been murdered in the most suspicious way possible. She collapsed. It was a proper, gut-wrenching tragedy for her. She blamed Mary, Queen of Scots at first. She wore a piece of jewellery, a locket, that supposedly had a tiny picture of the murder scene inside. A bit macabre, isn't it? Elizabeth eventually let her out because, well, the threat was gone. Margaret was just a heartbroken mother now. Or so Elizabeth thought. Margaret never really stopped. She eventually reconciled with Mary, Queen of Scots, which is a bit of a plot twist. She realised that they were both victims of the same game. She spent her final years in a house in Hackney. Not exactly a palace. She was living on a very tight budget. Almost poor. She died quite suddenly in 1578 after having dinner with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. There were whispers of poison. Naturally, there were always whispers of poison back then if someone died after a fancy meal. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb that's actually quite magnificent. It has a statue of her, and if you look closely, you can see all her children kneeling around the base. She was wearing a very expensive pair of velvet shoes when they put her in the ground. So, you want to know about the Devonshire manuscript. It's this messy leather-bound book that Margaret and her circle, mostly the Howards and the courtly cool kids, passed around to scribble poems, song lyrics and bit of gossip. They weren't just writing about the weather or how much they liked hunting. They were using poetry as a literal smokescreen for their illegal romances and political manoeuvring, because if you got caught, you could just say, "Oh, it's just a metaphor about a dear Uncle Henry, don't mind me." Code in rhyme. One of the cleverest things she did was using initials. She and Thomas Howard would sign their poems with T and M tucked away in the corners. Or sometimes they'd write verses where the first letter of every line spelled out a name. It's called an acrostic. Proper sneaky stuff. There's this one poem where she talks about a faithful heart and cruel fortune, which sounds like standard emo teenager material. But when you look at who she was actually writing to, it's a death-defying declaration of loyalty to a man the king had already forbidden her from seeing. Margaret was way better at it. She managed to weave these messages of defiance into the courtly love style that everyone was expected to use. Mind you, the handwriting in that book is an absolute nightmare. You've got Margaret's loopy, elegant hand, and then Thomas Howard's scrawl, which looks like he was writing while riding a very bouncy horse. Scholars have spent years squinting at these pages trying to figure out who wrote what. There's a bit of uncertainty about how much of it was actually original work. They used to copy out bits of poems by Thomas Wyatt, who was the king of My Life is a Mess poetry, and then tweak a few words to make it fit their own situation. It's like taking a sad song on Spotify and changing the lyrics in your head to be about your ex. Margaret would take a poem about a bird in a cage, and suddenly it's not a bird anymore, it's a royal princess stuck in the tower. The poems were a way to speak the truth in a world where the truth could get you killed. They'd leave the book in a window seat or under a cushion, and someone else would pick it up, read the hidden message, and write a reply on the next page. It was a slow-motion conversation happening right under the king's nose. I suspect Henry VIII knew what was going on, at least a little bit. He wasn't stupid, but as long as it was just poetry, he could pretend it wasn't happening until it became too public to ignore. It's that weird Tudor thing where if you say it in a fancy enough way, it's art, but if you say it plainly, it's treason. She even wrote about her grief after Thomas died, but she had to be so careful. She used these images of deadly hate and false reports to hint at the people who had ratted them out to the king. She was venting. She kept that manuscript for years. It was like a diary of her rebellion. So, you have to understand that by the time Margaret was getting on in years, she'd realised her own chance at the big chair was basically a pipe dream, because Elizabeth I was holding onto that throne with a grip like a caffeinated lobster. So she shifted all that frantic subterranean energy into her grandson, James. It was the ultimate long game. She'd already managed to get her son, that absolute train wreck Lord Darnley, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, which was a move so bold it basically gave Elizabeth a permanent migraine for 3 years straight. A masterstroke. Truly. Darnley was, by all accounts, a complete nightmare of a human being who spent most of his time in Scotland getting drunk, insulting the local nobles, and generally acting like he was the lead singer in a band that hadn't actually released any hits yet. I once had a flatmate who acted exactly like that, always talking about his vision while never actually doing the washing up, but at least my flatmate didn't have a legitimate claim to the crown of England. Margaret knew Darnley was a dud, but she also knew his DNA was gold. When James was born in 1566, Margaret basically had her winning lottery ticket. He was the great-grandson of Henry VII through both his parents. You couldn't get more Tudor if you tried. Mind you, Elizabeth was still childless and famously virgin, which meant the clock was ticking and everyone in Europe was looking at James as the only guy who could actually keep the lights on in England without a civil war starting the minute Elizabeth breathed her last. Margaret spent her final years in that draughty house in Hackney, just writing letters and pulling strings like a puppet master who's lost her eyesight, but still knows exactly where the threads are. She was making sure the English nobles knew that James was a safe bet, not like his mother Mary, who was currently locked up and causing all sorts of Catholic-related drama. James was being raised as a Protestant in Scotland, which made him much more palatable to the grumpy men in London who didn't want the Pope back in charge of their Sunday mornings. It was a bit of a gamble, or a lot of one. She died in 1578, which is a bit of a shame really because she missed the actual finale of the show by about 25 years. Elizabeth finally passed away in 1603 and James just walked in. No war, no blood. He just sat down on the throne and became James I of England. Everything Margaret had been imprisoned for, the secret marriages, the illegal letters, the years of social exile, it all finally paid off. Her blood was on the throne. The Douglases had won. Mind you, James wasn't exactly a ray of sunshine himself. He was obsessed with witches and had a bit of a hygiene problem, supposedly. Margaret's tomb in Westminster Abbey is actually positioned right near Elizabeth's. It's like she's still there, whispering, "Told you so," into the cold stone. She's got this incredibly elaborate effigy where she looks very stern and very royal, surrounded by her sons. It's a bold statement. She wanted everyone to know exactly who she was and what she'd accomplished. She was wearing a ring with a tiny skull on it when she died. Thanks so much for listening and sticking with me until the end.